We're here doing our book series, and I'm very, very happy to have an author that we've been keeping tabs on. Someone who's very talented, has been doing this for almost 30 years now. Engineer Ndukwe Uche. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me.
Great, great. Thank you for joining. As I said, we're really excited to have you here and talk about your book, Ofia Became Home. It's a book that I think speaks to a lot of people in Eastern Nigeria, and we think can transcend that. So we're really excited to dig in. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the book itself?
Okay. Once again, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you everybody that is participating and listening from wherever you are joining this call from. My name is Ndukwe Uche. I come from a village in eastern Nigeria called Ibere. I grew up there, and from there I pursued education. First, not very far away from the village, but eventually to the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, where I graduated in electrical engineering in 1981. Following graduation, I pursued an engineering career with an oil company, and that career took me around the world. But all through the engineering career and before, I've been writing things down. Initially, just out of curiosity, out of the love of writing. Mm-hmm. But eventually, I began to get serious about writing full-length novels and other materials. Mm-hmm. And have so far published 3 books, including the one we are talking about today. Mm-hmm. So I'm essentially an engineer who writes.
Awesome. That's the best kind of engineer, I would say. Using the left side of your brain and the right side of your brain. So I think you're a well-rounded individual, and we're happy to have you here. And speaking of your other book, I have it right here. Their Son, Her Brother. It's not what we're talking about today, but I highly recommend it to all of our listeners, for sure. It's a great story, and it has something for everyone, definitely. So talking about this book, Ofia Became Home, why don't you give us, a really short summary of what the book is about?
Okay. First of all, for those who do not understand the Ibere dialect of the Igbo language, Ofia means bush or forest. And bushes and forests are not normally home to anybody. Mm-hmm. When war approaches a community, the natural tendency is for people to move to a different population center, expecting to have refuge amongst friends, relatives, or government agencies who can guarantee the basics like accommodation and food. But that is if there is such a place to run to. As it happened for this story, the Ibere people had already exercised that option when many of them left their lives and livelihoods in many Nigerian and Biafran cities and went back to their village of birth, where they expected to make their last stand. And being that the real war front was quite far away from the village, they had no reason really to expect that the war they had run away from would catch up with them at their last stand. Mm-hmm. So they weren't looking forward to going anywhere. Nobody was making any plans to go anywhere. But when war arrived at Ibere very late in the war itself, already 2 years in, there weren't many places that people could run to. the neighboring villages were as threatened as Ibere itself. And there weren't many other Biafran territories, even further afield, that people could run to.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't even any time to plan where to go, what to do. So the people of Ibere, almost instinctively and almost collectively, as if there was some kind of prior understanding that that was what they should do, ran into their own farms and forests, not entirely sure that they would make a new home there,
Mm-hmm.
purely because that seemed to be the only way to go
Mm-hmm.
in time. So this book really is a unique story of how the people of Ibere relied on each other and their ancient communal spirit to defy huge odds in the forest for 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
They went on to sort of rebuild their lives under the guns, so to speak, because the enemy invaders who took over their homesteads were just over the horizon. But for 9 months, in very, very dire circumstances, the people recreated a sense of community and carried on against major odds. That's
Mm-hmm.
what the story is about.
Mm-hmm.
About resilience and even some degree of normalcy in the face of the most dire of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good summary. Thank you for that. And just to ask a question based on something that you said, that there was almost a sense of normalcy. Um, some of the families end up in the bush, and they, not that they don't skip a beat, but they're able to um, manipulate the situation and able to do things, like put together raffia palms, all those types of things, and catch certain food animals. They do these things almost instinctively and very, very quickly, as if there's this inbuilt survival mode in them. Would you say that was the case back then? Or what do you think was the reason for that ability to just quickly adjust to the bush situation?
It was essentially the communal spirit I referenced earlier, the ability to fall back on each other in a very difficult situation, something the people were already used to doing in normal circumstances. So it was really more of what you will see strewn over the book, Ele Ibeme, Ibeme, as others do, I will do.
Mm-hmm.
And then trying to do that together as much as possible. It helped that they were on their own farmlands and bushes. There was some sense of familiarity with their environment.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't entirely feel like outsiders or people completely taken out of their natural environment. Yes, they were taken out of their homesteads with no warning, with very little, only what they could carry on their backs or drag with their hands. But they were on their own soil still. And so that kind of helped them begin to forge ahead, even though there was so little to do that with.
Mm-hmm. In the book as well, there seems to be, you do a great job, I feel, of, yes, you're telling a story of survival, but there's also a little bit of a class element in the book, where some people, as you mentioned in your summary, were able to go to the neighboring village or another town almost and hide out with relatives or friends, well, some people didn't even have the option. Was that your intention of bringing that to bear, or was that just a circumstance?
The vast majority of Ibere people couldn't go anywhere else, even if they wanted to, even if they had the means of doing that. There just wasn't enough warning to plan for that, and there just weren't many options of to places to go to other than the bush. So people arrived in the bush just as they were, and since people were at different wealth levels already, people were in different places in terms of their accumulated wealth. They also arrived in the bush with those differences, even though everybody left a lot behind. So yes, in the bush, some, not that many, were able to survive on a lot of stuff that they brought into a lot comparatively. But the vast majority carried only 1 or 2 days worth of survival food, and had to rely on foraging and other kinds of survival activities to keep themselves from starving. So yes, there was still some social status differences. Currently, Ibera wasn't a society of extreme class distinctions. Whatever class distinctions we had was still reflected right the bush. For the simple fact that if some people, those who were wealthy, were able to bring in a lot because they had servants and people like that who could help carry a lot of things into the bush, even at such short notice.
And one of those people that you would have expected to be a bit more comfortable in this scenario than the others is Mborie, the young girl who gets into a relationship with the choir master. Her family had a very quick plan of where they were going to go and thought they were going to take their daughter with them, but she literally strayed away and got caught up with the choir master. What do you think, as when putting these almost two opposite characters together, what did that do for the book itself and in the story? Well, what did you feel about their relationship and what it contributed to the story?
I will let the reader be the best judge of that in terms of what it does for the book. But what was intended was to show that tenderness continues even in a war situation, because that kind of tenderness is not by design. People didn't plan it, but they didn't exactly plan to have a quote-unquote relationship with the choir master. The choir master didn't plan it and even welcome it initially. You could say that it happened. There was a girl whose fiance had gone off to war after getting engaged with her, leaving her in the lodge romantically. And so she was kind of primed for temptation. When that temptation came, she wasn't equipped for handling it any differently from how she handled it. So I believe what her little dalliance with the choir master shows is that just because war is raging, it doesn't mean that human emotions are all suspended. Okay.
I think that's true. That's true. And some people say stressful situations make you do things that are out of character, perhaps, or maybe it is in character. Readers will have to read the book to find out. We don't want to give too much away. Another character I just wanted to ask you about is Okorie. Um, there's definitely a sense of respect between him and his father, which is expected. Um, but he leaves his father behind, and that is at the wishes of his father. Um, is that uh, is that a sign of the times in terms of strict obedience to your parents, and it's an unwavering obedience, and how, because he does come back to try and get him as if he made a mistake. Do you feel that it's that cultural aspect of listening to your parents all costs almost cost him his father?
Yeah, that's another area where the reader will probably have to decide for himself or herself what uh, how to explain Okorie's behavior. But as the author, what was being reflected there was a kind of inevitability, actually, because he did everything he could to persuade his father to join them in the Exodus. Uh, but the old man was true to character amongst people of his age
Mm-hmm.
by insisting on staying behind to die where his ancestors died and possibly be buried where his ancestors were buried. Short of carrying him, there was really nothing much Okorie could do at that point. The reader may notice that even the man's wife joined in pleading with him to come along, but he was that kind of person. Once he made up his mind, nobody would change that mind for him.
Mm-hmm.
Okorie had the responsibility of carrying stuff together with the rest of the family in their own flight. He just couldn't have afforded to carry an old man as well. That's really why, because of the love he had for the man, that's why he made the decision, first of all, to have the family stop over instead of carrying on to the wife's preferred destination. They made an early stop so he could go back and try to bring the father out.
Mm-hmm.
Without load, he had a reasonable chance of carrying the man on his shoulders if he had to. So in a sense, he didn't actually obey the man's instruction. He simply resigned initially to the situation
Mm-hmm.
presented itself. But because he loved the man so much, he was determined to go back and do whatever he could do to bring him out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this is the 60s and in the village, and it's not as if there were vehicles around you could just throw him throw your father in the back of and zoom off. It wasn't that simple. So yeah, I think that's a very good description of that. Um, just to go back to your process, your writing process, how did you go about putting this book together? Was it mostly your memories, or did you find out people's stories and use that for the book? What was that process like?
I lived the experience in the book. So yes, memory did yield a lot of the content in the book. But I made a decision a long time ago that whenever I got around to writing this book, which I always wanted to write, it wouldn't be my story. Therefore, my memory was never going to be sufficient for doing a book like this.
Mm-hmm.
It needed to be a book about Iberi people. So I had to do some research, and that research included fielding the recollections of other people,
Mm-hmm.
my own elder brother, some friends. I actually intended to also interview lots of elders, do very extensive interview of people much older than myself, Unfortunately, because of COVID in 2020, when I did most of the writing and the distance, that level of interview didn't happen. But the process was essentially that of putting down what I could recall and then getting the input of some other people who were uh, part of the story, so to say. As it turned out, some of those people were not in the bush. And initially, they thought that their stories would not be relevant for what I told them I wanted to do. But when I insisted, and they shared their stories anyway, even though those stories had nothing to do with life in the bush, I found them relevant in rounding out the story of Ibere people at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's the way I approached it. In terms of the mechanics, it was simply a matter of laying down, first of all the raw materials that I gathered or could remember, and subsequently trying to craft the story.
Mm-hmm.
As you have noticed, the novel format is what I have used. It's not a raw historical account of names and dates and places. An attempt has been made to make it into a creative piece of work. And so, yes, the facts are there, but those facts have been woven into a story that has quite a fair amount of fiction in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the language and the style has been that of a typical work of fiction in the novel genre.
I think that really shines through because, you know, when I did mention this book to someone, they said, "Oh, not another history book." I said, "No, it's a fiction book based on true events," and I think that's a novel approach that we don't have too much of in African literature. So we really embrace that. My last question that I have for you, and I thank you for your time, is what do you want the younger generations to get from this? From reading this book, what are you hoping that they come out of this with?
Okay, that question is a great one because it allows me to talk about the various audiences I have in mind for the book. The young people are but one of the audiences, and even they break down into various subcategories. They are the young people of Ibere, because the story is their story. They never lived the experience. They have heard bits and pieces of what happened, but I don't know whether any of them has actually seen the story written down in any form anywhere. So the hope is that young Ibere people now have something they can reference. One hopes that they will feel a sense of pride in the resilience their parents showed, in the outcome that was possible through communal living, and that they will see a bit of their culture, part of the culture we've lost. That story. As a matter of fact, and in the early chapter of the book, actually chapter 1, there's a fair amount of description of certain landmarks in the village. So one hopes that, well, even if they've been to the village, or if they've never been to the village, that chapter alone will give them a sense of what the Ibere was like, physically and culturally back then. So that's it for the young people of Ibere. It is also an Igbo story. So one hopes and expects that younger Igbo people, let me put it that way, younger, would have quite a bit to take away from it in terms of the overall experience of the Igbos in the Biafra War, away from the hot war fronts. As indicated in the blog of the book, The book recognizes that there are several fronts to a war. And in this case, it's deliberately focusing on what some may call the home front of this particular war. So young Igbos everywhere, hopefully this throws a bit of spotlight on what people went through behind, far away from the war front, even though one could argue that the war front did come to better in this case.
Mhm.
Okay, now young people everywhere, one hopes that this brings home to them the traumas of war. Some people romanticize wars, and some are numb to wars just from hearing so many stories of wars, old wars, new wars, almost every day. I hope that this book lays bare the need not to allow ourselves to be numb to the suffering, needless suffering that war causes, especially when wars are allowed to stretch terminably. It is the ordinary people who bear the brunt, even as the heroes from the war fronts enjoy the respect, recognition, and gratitude that they have earned. It is the ordinary people, children, women, men, that bear a huge portion of the brunt of a war that drags on and actually begins to seep into people's ordinary lives. And people all over, whatever their ages around the world, one also hopes that this helps refocus on the impact of wars in general, the negative impact of wars in general. I actually don't know whether there are any positive impacts of wars, but the negatives sometimes we think are obvious, but maybe looking at one more that is unique will help us, all of us, remind ourselves that wars are not to be approached lightly because they do cause immense damage to ordinary people. And refugees, in almost every day we hear of refugees from one war or one condition or another. And sometimes they look like something that happens to other people. One hopes that this book makes it clear that being a refugee is a highly traumatic experience under all circumstances. One also would expect that reading this book, people would come to a more empathetic view of those who are struggling today with refugee conditions, even if they have access to more help than the better people had in those farms and forests. Okay.
I think that's a very good message, and I think it hits home and makes the book relatable for anybody, really, especially the people back home. Thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing about this book. If you're interested, you can go to Ofia Became Home, that's OFIA becamehome.com, to find out more about the book. It's available on Amazon, Google Books, the Apple Bookstore as well, and anywhere else that you find books, you'll be able to order it and get a copy in your hands. So thank you again. We appreciate your time, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you for having me.